Marine Silver Star recipient William Whorton was both enlisted and officer in the Marines, serving 2 combat tours in Vietnam. A polyglot, he speaks several Vietnamese and Chinese dialects, enabling a deeper understanding of Asian and Southeast Asian cultures. Whorton taught and lectured for over 30 years at Thailand's premier university, Chulalongkorn. He has returned to Vietnam 14 times, seeking and learning from former North Vietnamese, Viet Cong, and South Vietnamese soldiers. And now Whorton will provide you his views on the South Vietnamese Army, gleaned from his time as a senior battalion advisor to ARVN.
Hello, I'm Bill Whorton, and this is a continuation of our Vietnam Insane Asylum series. Today, I'm going to talk about being a senior battalion advisor to the South Vietnamese Army. This was an incredible assignment for me, but one of the things that I want to caution our friends out there about is we're going to have to deal with complexity in this particular session, because I've noted a lot of my comments from our friends out there, and I try to answer all the comments that I can from all our friends out there. Is a lot of people seem to have opinions about the South Vietnamese Army's this, the South Vietnamese Army's that, the South Vietnamese people are this, the South Vietnamese people are that, et cetera, et cetera. My answer to all that is, please, no. It's very, very complex. For example, the greatest act of cowardice I ever saw in Vietnam was committed by my battalion. Also, the most courageous thing I ever saw in Vietnam was committed by my battalion, an air assault on Hill 492. So my own battalion simultaneously committed the greatest act of bravery I ever saw, and also the greatest act of cowardice I ever saw in combat. It's complex. So one of the things that I want my friends out there to try to deal with is you can't use expressions about South Vietnamese people that, this, and South Vietnamese Army this and that, and because it doesn't work. It's just simply too complex. Okay, now having got that out of the way, one of the things that I had to really work on hard, and I want my friends out there to understand this, I was a former platoon commander for 16 months. 10 months was in combat. It's one thing to command a platoon of Marines. A platoon of Marines is 60 Marines. A battalion is over 1,000. So one of the things that I had to do, and I knew I had to do this before I went to Vietnam my second time, is I had to get my mind to deal with the fact that I wasn't dealing with 60 Marines anymore. I was going to be going into a world in which I would be in charge of 1,000, over 1,000 soldiers. And so I had to learn to move my thinking from platoon level to battalion. And now I didn't have the comfort of going through the company level. In other words, I wasn't a company commander or any of that. I went directly from being a platoon commander to senior battalion advisor, which means that I had to be able to fight and operate at a battalion level immediately. In other words, I had to go from being a second lieutenant to being the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel. One of the things is I was aware of that. And so I sought the advice of a lot of sergeants and a lot of officers, including very senior officers, about how to make this transition. And one of the places where I made the transition also was I was lucky at the MATA course. I've talked about the MATA course before, and in another video, so I won't go over that again. But I was lucky enough to meet some very fine officers at the MATA course who also gave me some good advice. Now I go to Vietnam. It's June 1968. As I mentioned before in another video, there has been the Tet Offensive is over. Everybody that's rational understands that the war is over, okay? That our side is lost. But at the same time, I'm going over to find out because I want all of our friends out there to remember I am obsessed by finding out why are we losing the war. That's why I volunteered to go back and fight again. And especially I wanted to fight as a senior battalion advisor in the South Vietnamese Army, because I wanted to live with the Army, the South Vietnamese Army. And also I wanted to be in an Army, U.S. Army command, which was MACV.
To find out what Whorton discovered as to why the U.S. was losing the war, he provides his answer in this video on this channel, Yai Fong, Ho Chi Minh's Transcendental Stratagem for Liberation. After watching that video, I encourage you to also view my video, How the U.S. Fought the Wrong Conflict.
So I schemed and schemed and schemed, and I was able to get a position as one of the very few Marines with the United States Army fighting in Vietnam. So I was able to get that. So I go through the transition from Saigon. I had to be briefed down there 4 days, then go up to Da Nang for a couple days, then go to Hue for a couple days. And then finally I get out to Dong Ha, which is the command post for the 2nd Regiment, which is what I'm assigned to. I'm going to be senior battalion advisor to 3rd Battalion, 2nd Regiment, 1st Division, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So anyway, I get up to my regimental command post and I meet my boss, who's Lieutenant Colonel Donald E. Parsons, United States Army. Now, when I report into my post, the radio is on full blast, and I'm listening to one hell of a firefight going on the DMZ. One of our battalions up there is surrounded by a North Vietnamese unit, and they are fighting like hell. And this is just one hell of a firefight going on. And I'm listening to the advisor up there, an Army captain. I will call this captain John Doe for obvious reasons, because we'll talk about him later. And so I'm listening to the advisor up there, and I am listening to an artist. I mean, I have never heard a symphony in combat conducted in as artistic manner as this captain was doing it. His battalion commander, his counterpart, we call them counterparts. His counterpart, the lieutenant colonel up there, had just had his eyes shot out. And so the captain was fundamentally fighting the battalion. And the way he was using artillery, the way he was using air assets, the way he was it was just artistic beyond belief. I was just blown away by this officer's competence. And I knew that I had to talk to this guy, because this guy could teach me so much about how to fight in the demilitarized zone where we were. I was able to meet him after the fight was over. He was able to get the battalion out, and I met him before I went off to my post. And I had a long conversation. Fortunately, I had a bottle of scotch with me already, too. So I gave him a bottle of scotch, which he promptly drank. And I found out also Captain Doe was an alcoholic. Before he got stone drunk, he was able to teach me a lot about how to fight along the DMZ. He taught me about the importance of how to use the forward air controllers. We had the forward air controllers we had. I talked about this in another video at Ashow, Colonel Yarborough. These forward air controllers were Air Force officers, and they were just the greatest. I mean, they were just courageous beyond belief, and they knew everything that was going on up there. So he taught me how to coordinate with them, and Doe taught me how to coordinate with Black Cat. I've already talked about Black Cat in another video. This was the 282nd Assault Helicopter Company, and these were mostly warrant officers, some officers, and commanded by, I think, a major. Black Cat was the radio call sign. These guys were warriors beyond belief. They had no fear. So anyway, I'm getting briefed by Captain Doe. And then after that, I go up to my outpost, which is Alpha 1. And I meet my sergeant. The team sergeant is Sergeant First Class Tom Hippensteel. Now, Hip and I were destined to become brothers in combat. We became brothers. And we stayed together until year after year. I visited him 3 times in the United States. I talked to him 3 days before he died, and I was able to tell him that I just simply worshiped the ground he walked on because he was brave, smart beyond belief. So I met him, and I met other members of my team, including a Marine Corps Second Lieutenant Anthony Kozarski. And I want to mention him because he was a great Marine. And then there was another senior warrant officer. Anyway, I met my team, and then I met the Vietnamese, and they were kind of surprised I could speak Vietnamese, and so we got along quite well. And then right after that, there was an artillery attack, and I called in Black Cat. We got the wounded, the dead out. By the way, this was almost a daily occurrence. The artillery on the DMZ was something that it was beyond anything that I had ever experienced in my life. As a platoon commander, I had never experienced anything like this. I kind of want to talk about the artillery up there because it was just so horrible. Actually, according to a lot of the histories that we read, we were actually outgunned on the DMZ by the North Vietnamese. They had a lot more artillery than we did. And they just pounded us all the time. We would go out on an operation, and we could get 150 rounds of artillery on us. And there we would lay on the ground, bouncing up and down off the ground. On one occasion, I was behind a South Vietnamese soldier, and I was just on the ground a little bit lower. And then all of a sudden, I looked up, and I saw this head looking at me. I said, "That's strange." And then I looked up a little bit more, and the head was laying on his back. A piece of artillery, a shrapnel, had cut his head off. He was beheaded, and his head was on his back, and his eyeballs were sitting there looking at me. And we were just bouncing up and down. So it was after a number of these attacks, many times it would happen, is blood would start coming out of my nose and my ears. And I would see blood coming out of the South Vietnamese soldiers. It would come out of their eyes, ears, and nose because it was the concussion. The concussion would be so strong. But that's the kind of thing that we faced up there. It was regular. I think the Marines that survived 1967, late 66, 67, the Con Tien, they underwent the same kind of thing. It was just horrible. So anyway, we were up there on the artillery side. So anyway, I report in, and everything is going fairly smooth right away. And then one thing that happened that was really interesting as far as the artillery goes, we get all of a sudden a helicopter shows up, and Black Cat shows up, and an Army specialist comes out with his Peace Corps beads hanging off of his neck, and all that kind of thing. And it was, peace symbols on his helmet and all that. And he has a beard, and Hip and I are looking at him and going, wow. But it turns out he also has a machine with him. And I think this machine is called a star scope. And it turns out that this guy is one of the most knowledgeable people on artillery that I have ever met. He was just amazing. He taught us a lot about how to use artillery up there. So, for example, at night, the North Vietnamese were heavy into infiltration. He showed us on the star scope, and we looked out on the star scope, and we could see hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers coming across the DMZ. And we would just watch them. They were coming across the DMZ, and he says, "Now, look, what we're going to do is we're going to get artillery concentrations from this post, and this post, and we're going to do a time on target." and he showed us how to do that. So he said, here's what we're going to do. We'll wait till they get concentrated to some extent. And then sure enough, they concentrated, and he said, time on target. And then he called in he had everything prearranged, all prearranged fires on there. And I mean, it looked like they had a bomb going off on the star scope. If we looked at the star scope and looked at all the debris and all the ground and everything like that going on, it looked like we killed everybody. But we knew better than that, because they dug foxholes in down there, and they had trenches down there, and they were hiding in those. So the next day in the morning, what I would do is I would get the forward air controller, and the forward air controller would come over, and I said, have you got anybody down from the north? Because we got a whole bunch of, North Vietnamese out there. And I said, have you got any, did anybody not use all their bombs and stuff? And the fact said, okay, let me call them up. And then he'd call up some of the groups coming down, and before they go back to Da Nang or wherever they were going to go, they would start dropping napalm, and they would stop dropping bombs. And I mean, these were heavy bombs because they were bombing the north. So this would be maybe 500, 750, maybe 1,000-pound, 2,000-pound bombs. Foxholes aren't going to protect against that. So we were killing lots and lots and lots of North Vietnamese. But the infiltration was still going on. We could see the North Vietnamese passing our outpost, Alpha 1, in large numbers, and we couldn't call in artillery because we'd call the artillery in on us. And so we would watch these rivers of North Vietnamese soldiers heading south on these infiltration routes. And they never stopped. You could kill and kill and kill, but they would never stop. And so this was our life on the DMZ. Now, we were lucky. The North Vietnamese at this time were not into taking territory. So they didn't knock off our outpost, because they could have knocked our outpost off anytime they wanted to. But they weren't into taking territory at that time. So we were lucky. So anyway, that continued. When I started off with my battalion, one of the first things we had to do, this was in the middle of June. We had another operation, and we were supposed to be the right flank. There was going to be a large army unit that was going to move into the DMZ to try to take out a number of the outposts of the North Vietnamese outposts into the DMZ. I think it was the 5th Mech, but I'm not sure. So anyway, they were moving up, and our battalion was going to have to move off of Alpha 1 and move down and cover their right flank, because you couldn't fight the DMZ without having your flanks covered. And then I briefed my counterpart. Now, my counterpart, his name is Major Nguyen, Nguyen, Hu, Huu, and then Tong, Thong. And he and I became very, very, very close, but in a strange way, and I'll explain later. I'm talking with Major Tong, and we're talking about what we're going to be doing. I've already set up some artillery places to help him out, and I've coordinated that with him, and we're all set to go. But I've noticed one thing: he's very, very nervous, and so we moved the battalion out, big open area, next to Alpha 1. So we're moving out in this open area, and then all of a sudden, a couple snipers come off, and then I watched the whole battalion just lay down, and I'm the only one standing up because there's just a couple snipers, and I hear Major Tong shout some stuff, and then the whole battalion just picks up and literally runs back to Alpha 1. They just pick up, and I'm standing out. I'm standing out in the middle of this rice paddy with him, and my jaw has dropped down to my waistline someplace, and I'm watching my battalion run off back to Alpha 1, and Hip is telling me, Captain, we better get our ass in gear. And so, yeah, you're right. Okay, so I run back to Alpha 1, and then but before I run back to Alpha 1, I call my I call my boss, Colonel Parsons, and say, look, you've got to tell this army unit there's nobody on their right flank. There's nobody there. So and then he starts. I said, "Don't ask me anything more, sir. I got to get back with my battalion." So I'm running back with them. So I go to see Major Tong. I say, "Well, why aren't we, on that unit's right flank?" And he's sitting around there smoking and joking with with the battalion staff. And he said, "Today's not our day. Jupiter's not lined up with Mars, and Mars is not lined up with Venus, and Venus isn't lined up with something else. And so today's not our day to fight." And I said, "But there's an American unit out there whose right flank is completely uncovered, and I've reported that already to Colonel Parks." He said, "Well, you reported it already, so their right flank is uncovered. They can cover it up some other way or something like that." And at that point, I just exploded. It was a big mistake on my part. I should have known better, but I just exploded. I was just enraged that they would do something like that. So anyway, I started cussing them. And I mean, I used some of the vilest language I've ever used in my life. And I ended by saying, "All of you should take off your military uniforms. You're not fit to wear military uniforms. You should put on ao dai." Now, ao dai is the national female dress. You should all put on ao dai dresses because you're not fit to wear uniforms. And by this time, they're all screaming at me too. So, I mean, this is not a good beginning. So I walked back to my bunker, and then Hip has been with me. He didn't understand the Vietnamese, but he understood that something bad had really happened. And so Hip walked back to me, and he sat down, and he looked at me very, very quietly, and he said, "Captain, I don't know where you think you are, but you'd better pull your head out of your ass and look around and figure out where you are." He said, "You are not in America. You are not in the United States Marine Corps. You're not in the United States. You're in Vietnam, and you're sitting on a hill with over 1,000 Vietnamese on it, and you better figure out where you are." And I looked at him and I said, "You're right." I said, "I screwed up." But I said, "It's going to be pretty dangerous in here." So I said, "I don't want anybody sleeping in the bunker tonight." And Hip said, "Don't worry, nobody is. You're here by yourself." He said, "Do you want me to call in a black cat to pick you up? Maybe I'll live through the night. Maybe I won't live through the night. Don't know." I said, "No, I made the mistake. I made the call, and I'll take the result." I said, "You guys take out." So all night long, I sat up with my loaded M16, and but nothing happened. So they decided not to kill me. But things got a bit tense for a while. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, I called in the black cats, and so I communicated through the battalion, some of the battalion staff officers, but not through my counterpart. My counterpart wouldn't speak to me. Major Tong wouldn't talk to me. So the battalion, a couple of the battalion officers, they come and coordinate things that had to be coordinated. So, but I was very, very lucky because that lasted for about 4 weeks. And then 4 weeks later, we had to go on another operation. This is in the middle of July. This operation, I'm not going to go into the details because it would just simply be too complicated. But one of the things that we had to do is we had to make an air assault. And we had to make an air assault with the 1st Air Cav. And oh God, what an honor that was. The 1st Air Cav. Now remember from other videos of mine that I have such respect for the 1st Air Cav Airmobile. Remember, I as a platoon commander in November 1965, we were so excited about the great victory of the 1st Air Cav down in the Ia Drang Valley. And so I was just excited beyond belief because I had a chance to work and operate with the 1st Air Cav. So the 1st Air Cav was going to be our support for our assault on Hill 492. which was exactly on the Laotian border. And it was in Khe Sanh. It was in the Khe Sanh region. We planned for that. And then when the operation kicked off, we made the air assault on Hill 492, and it was covered with North Vietnamese. It was in North Vietnamese bunkers were all over the place, and it was hot. I mean, it was really, really, really hot. My counterpart, Major Tong, he did the finest tactical air assault I have ever seen in my life. Our soldiers ran up into those bunkers. They dropped their rifles, ran up into those bunkers with hand grenades, and I was sitting there watching. I was watching hands, North Vietnamese hands being blown out of trenches, body parts being blown out of trenches, legs being blown out, everything. It was incredible. Our battalion literally killed every North Vietnamese on the top of that hill. And they were in 2 sets of bunkers. We lost 6 of our people, and I don't remember how many wounded we had, but it was. But there were a lot of dead North Vietnamese up there. We did that together, and then after that, Major Tong and I and a couple others, we were on top of the hill, and then a blast came off, and we had a U.S. Army artillery liaison officer with us for the operation. And he was standing between Major Tong and myself. And then there was one more, I think it was rocket landed on top of the hill. The American liaison, artillery liaison, he was the first lieutenant. He just fell to the ground. And I looked at his back, and it was covered with some kind of, and I took my K-mark off, cut the shirt off of his back, and it was covered with this brown goo. I think it was his lungs. I scraped the lungs off, or whatever it was. I scraped that off his back, and then we got the surgeon. But he got back to the rear okay. We had the helicopters there already, so we got him on. But he died on the operating table, and that was very, very unusual. I'm reporting that because it was very unusual for somebody to live to reach the operating table and then die after that. That was kind of unusual. So he had 32 days left to do in Vietnam, and then he was killed. After that fight, though, Major Tong came over to me and he said, "You and Hip, we will eat together tonight." And he said, "From now on," he said, "you and Hip will eat with me every meal in the field." And at that point, Major Tong and I became very, 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 very close. And I became basically one with the battalion. Hip and I became one with the battalion after that. This was the start of another very, very interesting journey, because we did become one with the battalion after that. And after the operation was over, Major Tong invited Hip and me out to a place near Dong Ha, have lunch out there. And so we went out to this place to have lunch. And it was very poor food. A few pieces of fish and some rice and some vegetables, and off of a real battered tin. And I looked around where we were, and we were in a kind of a village, but the village had a lot of people in it with no arms and no legs, and a lot of kids and women. And I wondered where we were. And then Major Tong told me, he said, "These are members of my battalion." And he said, "We are supporting them." And I said, "You're supporting them, but the government is supposed to supporting them," because I knew from my medic courses that the government had all kinds of programs for supporting the orphans, for supporting widows, supporting this, supporting that. They had all kinds of programs. But Major Tong told me, he said, "But none of that applies, because corruption has eaten everything out. They don't get anything. It's my responsibility to look after my soldiers." And he said, "Can you help?" And so this was the invitation, because now, since we were part of the battalion, well, we had to do something. But I looked at Hip and I said, "Wow, what can we do? This is not a case of just doing Now, Hip and I are old soldiers. We know all about what is called midnight requisitioning. Midnight requisitioning is where experienced soldiers go out and steal things that they need from less experienced soldiers. And Hip and I were masters of that. This is not a case of just one load of food or one load of lumber, or I mean, they need schools. They need now Major Tong. He had an officer there that didn't like combat, but he was a teacher. So he put that officer in charge of teaching the kids. So they had a school, but no school. It was all outside. There was a lot of things to do. But I told Hip, I said, this is not a case of just, this is not a one-time deal. I said, we're going to have to get a lot of material. We can't just steal this stuff in a one-time deal. No way. So I said, okay, I know what I want to do. So I went down to Hue, and I talked to a military. I had a buddy of mine down there from the Mandarin course. He was an army. He was an army captain. He was a military police. Good friend of mine. We became friends at the Mandarin course. So I walked in on him, and I said, look, here's the situation. I need a lot of material. I'm going to need cement. I'm going to need lumber. I'm going to need food. I'm going to need a lot of things. How can I get this stuff without going to jail? I mean, he just started laughing at me. He said, boy, he said, you are really, really innocent. Because what I didn't understand at that time was how entirely corrupt the entire system was. The whole system was corrupt. I mean, I described how my battalion was not getting they weren't getting what they were supposed to from the government. And he said, this is common. He said, this is all throughout Vietnam. He said, it's a mafia. The whole place is a mafia. And he says, you don't understand that? And he said, boy, he said, it's like you're born yesterday, kind of thing. So he said, here, okay. And then he described what has been happening. There are battalion commanders, like my battalion commander, like Major Tong, who took great responsibility for their people. But there were other battalion commanders that ripped off their troops also, took their money. Ghost soldiers, made battalion of ghost soldiers, but put a couple hundred extra, troops in their battalion, took the money from that. And there were advisors who did the same thing. There were advisors that were taking off all kinds of materials and stuff like that, selling it back to private, the private sector. Some battalion commanders were moral. Some battalion commanders were total crooks. Some advisors were straight. Some advisors were total crooks. I mean, there was a lot of money being made in Vietnam by a lot of people. And I just didn't understand it. And as a matter of fact, my friend told me, he said, look, there's this advisor that we're watching now, for example, that set up an airline in Laos and Cambodia. And probably it's going back and forth from China. But he set that up. It's an airline. And we know he's done it. We've reported it to Interpol, but there's nothing we can do about it because he's smart. And nobody is prosecuting anybody. This is a war. We're in the middle of a war here. We're fighting a war. And the war is the primary thing here. Nobody's going to jail for anything here. We're aware of all this stuff. As a matter of, but he said the fact that you're down here asking me about this stuff shows that you really don't know, you don't really know what's going on. And I said, no, I don't. And he said, okay. He said, let me tell you something right now. The kind of thing that you're interested in, he said, I'm going to give you the names of some units. And I'm going to give you the names of some organizations. He said, all that you're asking for is part of all of our pacification programs. It's all part of the pacifications program. It's all part of the CORDS, the civil operations for rural development. It's all part of that. He said, I'm going to give you the names of people that you can contact. You can get all the stuff you need, no problem at all. there won't be any difficulty on anything. When we got back up to the unit, we contacted these units. Not a problem. Truckloads of stuff showed up, and we were okay. And I talked to friends of mine in Dong Ha, Marine Corps friends of mine. We got garbage contracts for people. It was something that could be worked out. But the corruption levels were absolutely incredible. And by the way, the corruption levels were not just in the Vietnamese mafias, but I want to show all of our friends out there. I want to show it. See these books right here? These are all part of one investigation process for American corruption. And American corruption, this is called Fraud and Corruption in Management of Military Club Systems. Illegal currency manipulations affecting South Vietnam. And these were hearings that were conducted by a congressional committee in 1969. All these books. This is just one thing, one item of corruption from the U.S. side. We were able to really help out, at least in some degree. We were able to do some work on that. A number of my friends out there, I think, are going to be interested to know is like, well, after you and your counterpart became brothers, how did you feel about the South Vietnamese then? My reaction to this is, again, complicated. Because on one hand, I really loved my battalion. I mean, they were great soldiers. They were wonderful people. I liked them as persons. I liked them and I respected them to a certain degree as professionals. But at the same time, Hip and I both agreed we never trusted them. Everything is uncertain with them. You never knew what they would do. Now, which day would they be up? Which day would they not be up? And you can't depend on that. And so Hip and I lived in a world of uncertainty. But one of the good things is Hip and I were very, very comfortable with uncertainty. But other people did. For example, I mentioned a senior warrant officer. I won't mention names or anything else. But this senior warrant officer, he could not handle the uncertainty. And so over a period of time, he got a little bit strange, but everything was okay. He was a great soldier. I mean, very experienced old soldier, Korean War veteran. I mean, one day he exploded. I wasn't there when he did it, but he became little green men are eating me insane. He took his rifle out and started shooting in the bunker, started shooting all the little green men that were eating him. He went completely insane. So I wasn't there when this happened, but Hip was. So Hip and a couple other Vietnamese, they waited till he ran out of ammo and he was shooting up the bunker. And then they went in and Hip cold cocked him, knocked him out, and they tied him up completely, just roped him up totally. Called in a black cat and got him back to the hospital. This was not an uncommon experience. Dealing with this kind of uncertainty can make people react in different ways. Other people, when they were advisors, they just started hating South Vietnamese. They just started really, really hating them. Another Vietnamese advisor I'm familiar with, I knew this officer, he just started berating them. Now, this officer was a very courageous officer, very professional, but he just started berating them. I mean, using all the racial epithets, and it just very, very unpleasant. He just hated them, and he made no bones about it. I mean, he had very, very bad relationship with his battalion and battalion staff. And finally, one day, Hip came to me and told me, he said, look, he just got word from Vietnam. Hip knew everything. Hip knew everything going on in our regiment. Hip said they're going to kill him, and so I just got on the radio right away, and I called Colonel Parsons. I said, "Look, I just got word that they're going to kill this guy. We need to get a black cat in there and get him out. His mother died, his father died, something, and get him out now." And Colonel Parsons agreed with me 100%. And so got him out. Again, it gets complicated because a lot of times we loved our friends, but at the same time, we never trusted them. I could never trust Vietnamese the way I trusted Marines or I trusted Hip. Hip knew that no matter what happened, I was going to be with him no matter what. And I knew that if anything happened to me, Hip would be with me no matter what. Well, anyway, we're dealing with morality. My battalion commander was, again, one of the most moral people I ever met. He took care of his battalion. But also another thing that he did, and this is another thing that made a very strong impression on me, was we were in Ashau Valley. We were marching along, and all of a sudden, I heard one hell of a firefight going on. And the next thing I knew, I was called back. Get the advisor up. Get the advisor up. Okay, so I ran up. Now, one of the things that Hip and I did every morning in the field, Hip and I did what we call boil the billy. We got burning hot, dark, black Chinese tea because to walk the hills of Ashau, Quezon, and Balong Valley, we had to do something to fight the heat. And so Hip and I used hot tea, hot Chinese tea to fight the heat. So my counterpart knew that I always carried 3 canteens of hot tea with me. When they called for the advisor to come up after the shootout, I went up there and there were about six North Vietnamese soldiers, and they were all shot up. I mean, they were shot up bad, and they were obviously going to die. I think 1 or 2 had already died, but there were about 4, maybe 4 that were still alive. My counterpart, Major Tong, said, I want you to pour tea for these people. And so the South Vietnamese soldiers, we were breaking out their packs and getting little cups together, and I was pouring tea for them. And Major Tong was talking with them. They were from Nghe An province in North Vietnam. They had walked about 600 kilometers down to Ashau, and they'd been in Ashau Valley 6 years. And when I heard that, because I could understand every word they said, it was like talking like English, I realized that I was looking at men that were 100 times better than I am as a soldier. Endurance levels like that, my God, I'd been in Ashau Valley 6 weeks. I mean, I was crying like a baby after 6 weeks in Ashau. They'd been there 6 years after walking down there. And I realized at that point, I've talked about this before in another video called Yai Phong. They had Yai Phong. They were going to fight for liberation. And it was liberation or die. That was their thing. And I looked at my counterpart, Major Tong, also very, very red-eyed. I looked around at other South Vietnamese soldiers, and we were all, but nobody was sobbing like I was. Just rivers of tears were coming out. And then Major Tong told him, he said, we are going to stay with you until you go. There will be no red ants eating on you. There'll be no wild pigs eating on you. We're going to stay with you until you go. I've had people writing comments, can there be any compassion in war? And my answer to this is this. I watched Major Tong, and I have great, great respect. Yes, there is room for decency and kindness in war. And I watched it when I watched him, and I watched what he did. Again, war is complex. I have stated in other videos, you cannot be a military officer in combat unless you have a real streak of cruelty in you. You must have that ability to close. You have to have that desire to close with and kill. You've got to have that as an officer. Close with and kill. But at the same time, you've also, in my opinion, got to have a streak of decency and kindness to everybody, your own people, and also your enemy when the time is appropriate. There's an appropriate time for everything. That's the kind of man I served with. So that was basically the rest of my time. Everything that occurred after that, it was operation after operation after operation, artillery, calling in artillery, black hat. It was just operation after operation. It was all the same. On some days, they'd really, really be up. And other days, they would not really be up. So we learned to live with it. I mean, it was for us, we totally adapted to it. They're Vietnamese. We're part of them, and that's what we have to live with. One of the things that I did at the end of my tour in Vietnam, I told my counterpart, Major Tong, and I told a bunch of other Vietnamese, Vietnamization is another way of telling you that our time in Vietnam is coming to an end. Now, I'm an American. Culturally, I understand this, that we are telling you shortly you are going to be on your own. You know what the Vietnamese reaction was? No, you'll never leave us because you need us to fight your war for you. This is your war. You're fighting your war against communism and stuff like that. This is your war. You won't leave us. I said, believe me, we're going to do it.
And so we did. Concluding remark.
My friends, I just want to let you know, I read all of your comments. I read all of your comments very, very carefully. Now, I'm going to be out of off my computer for several weeks. So I will be reading your comments later, and I will make comments on them later, but I'm going to be off net now for a couple weeks. Thank you very much.